Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm going to completely change tack, if I can, and talk about something. I haven't thought this through at all, have I? I'm going to be talking a little bit more about what's below ground in terms of the linkages between plants and the soil, in all aspects of the soil. So we know that plants need to modify their soil environment in order to receive and gain the things that they can't get for themselves. And one of the things, importantly, is nitrogen. There are many forms of nitrogen that plants can't get for themselves. They can't use the gas in the sky, they can't use proteins for the most part, so they have to get somebody to do it for them. Phosphate similarly turns up in a lot of different forms. Rock phosphate, various other types of phosphate, that's just not accessible to plants. So in order to complete their life cycle, and for various other purposes, they will use their photosynthate, so the carbon that they fixed in different types of sugars. And we know that the plants have a huge number of choices that they have to make with this sugar that they fixed, with these carbohydrates. So they need to grow. They need to use it for defense, competition, shading, reproduction. But remarkably, about 40% of all photosynthate that is fixed by the plant is just chucked into the soil. And for a lot of the time, we don't know why. We don't know what it's doing for a lot of the time. We know that it's trying to recruit mycorrhizal fungi. We know that it's trying to recruit bacteria. But a lot of what is put into the soil is simply root exudates, which are simple chemicals, signaling compounds, various things, that are just put wholesale into the soil. And we think that a lot of it is to recruit a specific, and this is important, specific microbial community. So it's putting it into signaling compounds, it's putting it into attractive sweeties to get everything to come over and to live among the roots. And we've seen from that beautiful presentation that we've just watched how complex that root network can be in the soil. So plant soil feedback, we're going to talk a bit about what that is. It's been a fairly fixed and rigid definition for the last few years, certainly within the primary scientific literature, which I don't want to read. But basically what happens is that the plant has created its lovely environment for itself. It's made biotic, chemical, physical changes to its soil. And that will create a legacy that will last way beyond the plant's lifetime. And so most studies on plants, certainly in my area, which is like plant-soil relations, we tend to look at one generation. We look at the plant, it dies, we yank it out, and then we look at what's in the soil. But that legacy is incredibly important. And the plant can recruit either a positive, beneficial microbial community, it can increase its micronutrients, it can use hormones and various things to signal all of these friendly microorganisms, so mutualistic organisms such as mycorrhizae, as we've heard, plant growth-promoting rhizobacteria, of which there is a lot, plant-specific decomposers, and various things. These will help the plant by passing it some nitrogen and phosphate in return for the carbon, help it against drought stress, potential other stress, potentially ward against different sort of predators, like root predators in the soil, so, and potentially help it compete against its neighbors. So all sorts of roles that the plant can sort of choose to try and optimize by manipulating this kind of sugar balance. But the plants can also use a recruitment of a different kind and recruit some nasties to sit in the soil and to fend off things that might get in its space. And a lot of the time, and I'm not vilifying fungi, so don't come for me, but a lot of the time it's fungal pathogens. So we'll come on to that in a bit. But essentially what happens then is to quantify these plant soil feedbacks, we will measure the size and the performance of generation 1 of this plant, and then we'll grow the plant, the same species, in the same soil in generation 2, and we will compare the performance of generation 2. So if generation 2 is bigger and healthier and happier and maybe makes more seed and more viable offspring, that's positive plant soil feedback. If it's smaller, sicklier, less able to reproduce, that's negative plant soil feedback. And we'll come on to why that might be beneficial to the plant a bit later. But essentially, that is the mechanism. That's what we're looking at. So one of the issues with plant soil feedback is that we've known about this for centuries. We know that this happens. And one of the things that I've been working on is trying to reconcile various different terms that we know are plant soil feedback, but they're called different things. So soil sickness is a big one. We all know about soil sickness, right? You grow the same crop year upon year upon year, and suddenly they start to fail. They can't cope for for multiple generations in the same soil. Could it be that the nutrients are depleted? Could it be that there's a buildup of pathogens? Could be all of those things or none of those things. But we know soil sickness is a thing. That's why we have crop rotation. That's why we have all of these different ways of farming. We also can see soil legacy effects. We know that this is a thing. We know that this is real. But we can also see plant soil feedback in the way that our plant communities change over time. So succession is a big one. There are multiple drivers of succession, but one of them is that some of the more ruderal species, the ones that turn up first when you have an exposed soil, tend to accumulate some nasty things in order to sort of grow, complete their life cycle. And that means that then, once those are gone, you get this new generation of things like grasses succeeding to scrub and that kind of thing. So that's one of the drivers of succession. Also invasion, plant invasion, big problem, big deal. But one of the things that those plants are doing is making themselves a nice environment in the soil. So big positive feedback. So I don't want to downplay the insane complexity of the interactions that are going on above and below ground with plants, above and below ground soil, and these things do tend to impact the legacy of that plant. We've got to take it as a huge package, this holistic system. And don't read all of that. It's horrible. But, this is an enormously complex system. And it's not just, static. We're going through time as well. This is really important. So there's this temporal aspect as well, where the plant is growing, where it's changing, where it's flowering, where it's fruiting. And all of those things will make its chemical signature in the soil change and, the kind of microbes that it wants to recruit. So that adds an extra crazy layer of complexity. So the way that the plant can leave a legacy in the soil is not just through recruiting this microbial community, although a lot of it is. So one of the big things that we're interested in is how the chemical makeup of the plant, so the above ground portion and the below ground portion, that will remain as litter a lot of the time. And that leaves this kind of chemical and physical legacy in the soil. So if you haven't removed that root structure, then those roots will remain sort of decomposing, and that will become part of the legacy of that plant. And that can actually very negatively impact the next generation, particularly if it's the same species. The distribution of water and nutrients as well of the plant in its lifespan can also leave this, if it's depleted, a bunch of the nitrate or the ammonium or, whatever it is that it wants, that's left a depleted environment for its offspring or for the next generation. And let's not underestimate shading. Shading's a huge problem, actually, for many plants because it's directly reducing the photosynthate. It's reducing the amount of productivity of that plant. And that reduces how much carbon it can then put into the soil, which will then impact how effective it is at signaling and how effective it is at recruiting this microbial community. So this is really important. Why? Well, can't enormously speak to horticulture or gardening because I'm rubbish at both. But in terms of a sort of wild species diverse sward, what this means is that we can increase diversity by knowing how these plants interact and what sort of legacy they're going to leave in the soil. And some will help each other, they will facilitate each other. Sometimes plants want to be shaded. Sometimes they want to receive the water that maybe a dandelion lifts from the soil and passes out around its surroundings. Some of them do that. Some of them will actively try and kill everything in sight. So this is something that is, of interest to us as scientists. We want to know what's happening and why, and how this can help us to have healthy gardens, healthy swards, healthy agriculture as well. It's very important. Because we might start losing the species that we really want, especially if we plant them next to some incredibly unfriendly plant, which is possible. So there are some species that we know are great and friendly and accumulate some beautiful microbes. I don't know who these people are, but I'm told that they are heroes, so I hope for the best. I don't know. But we know that some of them are very healthy and very happy and very friendly to other plants. And for the purposes of this analogy, doesn't go very far, but the purposes of this analogy, I'm talking about the plants that will accumulate the mutualists, the plant decomposers, plant growth promoting rhizobacteria. So the things that will directly help other plants to grow and grow better. So one of them is perennial ryegrass. I think it probably gets a lot of hate. It's kind of your basic amenity grassland species, isn't it? Lowly and perennial. You chuck it on your village green and it grows beautifully year on year. And there's a lot of it. But it has this capacity to increase probiotic bacteria, which is really useful. And that's why you get these quite highly productive swards when you put in perennial ryegrass. So maybe a bit less hate. Legumes are an obvious example, very obvious example. What they're doing, of course, is they're associating with a rhizobacterium. In the roots, they form a beautiful little nodule house for it, and then that will help fix the nitrogen gas and make it into the inorganic nitrogen forms that plants want, so ammonium and nitrate, essentially. But they tend to make so much that they just kick it out around them in these beautiful fertile pools. So that's quite friendly to neighboring plants. And so what you tend to see, or quite often, is that you'll have a legume and then you'll have like quite a fertile patch of stuff around it. But it does tend to be opportunistic species. So, villains. Again, no idea. But for the purposes of this is the ones that accumulate the pathogens, the toxins, the nasties, because they want that kind of space. They want that ability to grow unimpeded, and often that goes for its own offspring as well. It doesn't want it near. Chrysanthemum. Apparently, this one's quite hateful because it will, over generations, it will create this incredibly toxic, pathogenic soil. So you have to keep refreshing the soil for chrysanthemums. Like if you wanted to grow them in the greenhouse, something like that, then that bears watching because he's, attracting some nasties. And this one probably doesn't even need an introduction. Potatoes are terrible. They, basically everything turns up for potatoes. Particularly a lot of these, sorry, I think I've done something. A lot of them are fungus, wilts, molds, various things. And as we know, you need about a 7-year rotation to get rid of this legacy. I mean, that is probably the most negative plant soil feedback I can think of. They will basically attract loads and loads of different fungal pathogens. And you have to do then like a cereal crop and then a carrot crop and then before you can get those potatoes back in the soil. So that's quite a legacy to have. Well, what can we do? And I don't want you to think that positive and negative plant soil feedback have necessarily the positive or negative influence on the wider ecosystem function and the wider environment, because there are benefits. Otherwise, the plants wouldn't do it. From an ecosystem point of view, a negative plant soil feedback, so if it's accumulating, if it's depleting the nutrients and it's accumulating these pathogens, what that leads to is increased coexistence of more plant species, higher biodiversity. So when we see like chalk grasslands, when we've got a beautiful sward, 50 species per square meter, at least half of them will have negative plant soil feedback, because that means that you're not getting these monoculture clumps, because they're just horrible to each other. So, the other thing that I want to point out, and I have mentioned it before, but invasion, like plant invasions, we know this is a huge problem across the world. Leylandii, various others that have gone completely out of my head, Himalayan balsam. But, they tend to have extremely positive plant soil feedback. They need to in order to establish in a new place. And so they will then have this kind of buddy system where all of these microbes will come and help them. The reason that quite a lot of the time they won't have a runaway plant soil feedback, although you don't get like a huge sward of them, is because they often can't quite cope with the conditions of the new place. But they do have, a bit of a head start with the microbial community. So, you kind of got this balance. So what can we do? Well, there's a lot of things that we've been doing for centuries, things that we know. And honestly, I don't have a silver bullet. I don't have an answer for like our horticultural problems and that kind of thing. The first one is crop rotation. We know that, especially with potatoes, but many other plants, many other crops, we need to keep rotating because they will have this legacy. And it could be nutrient depletion, it could be many things, but they have this unpleasant legacy that needs to be kind of broken before you can then introduce that crop again. So farmyard manure, composting, organic inputs. If you need to put inputs, keep it organic, because there's something about inorganic fertilizer that pathogens will just, they absolutely love it. So that's kind of a bit of an issue. I'm not saying that farmyard manure and so on is like perfect or anything like that, but inorganic fertilizer is very easily taken up and it's very easily just grabbed. So, that's one of them. And intercropping, which I realize, ignore the cow, but this bit at the bottom, we've got different species. So we've known that for centuries that to plant different species next to each other, neighbors, we'll kind of create buffer zones, we'll create, refugia for beneficial microbes and so on. So you do tend to get, especially with certain groups of species, they will tend to benefit each other, especially if you put a legume in between them, that kind of thing, So, I was asked to talk about climate change and what happens. So, we know that, well, there's a lot we don't know, actually. But we know that over the course of the plant's lifetime, things are going to change, the plant itself changes, it gets bigger, and so on. What happens when the climate changes? And honestly, we don't really know. We know a few things, but there haven't been many studies on this yet, and this is a bit of a failing. But it is being addressed, we are working on it. But we know what happens with temperature. So fungi love temperature, they love to be warmed, particularly in temperate areas. And so this does tend to increase incidence of fungal disease. And so this picture is fungal disease. And what that could mean is quite a big loss in crop production. So we're going to lose crisps, I think. But yeah, essentially that plants are going to actively recruit pathogens. The ones that do, that's going to take a long time to get rid of, particularly if we're constantly getting bombarded by more. So yeah, there's a potential threat to food security. Rainfall is an interesting one. This is something that I've worked on for many years, and we kind of have conflicting and site-specific, plant-specific responses to this. So when we know that when the plant is droughted, then microbes can't communicate with the plant so easily. There's less going on. The water that creates this kind of film on the soil surface, that is absolutely crucial for plant microbe communication. And so, when that is reduced, we expect processes to slow down and potentially stop. So less exudation, less respiration, less nutrient cycling. So these things will start to decline. Flooding, less is known. Hardly anyone looks at flooding, and yet it's a really important thing. And with flooding, of course, you're losing that kind of oxygenation in the soil. So again, communication breaks down between the plant and the soil. And we're really not sure. And of course, the thing is that everywhere, even in the UK, there's a huge swath of different rainfall patterns. I live in Manchester. We have a lot of rain. Down here, there seems to be a lot less. But essentially, what we have is this very site-specific, changing frequency, magnitude, amplitude of rainfall, where, being able to model and predict that and predict the effects on our plants is going to be very, very difficult to do. So, I talked about this kind of pore size situation where if the water is saturating the pores, that is a problem. Of course, permanent wilt point is where the plants can't get any more water out of the soil. And so then you kind of have these bacteria and so on that have no ability to kind of move within the water. They just kind of sit on the soil pore. And that means that until the drought is alleviated, you're stuck. There's nothing. So field capacity is sort of the ideal way of being. Now, the plant itself is going to change in response to water deprivation or water excess. So when you have, I'm going to talk about drought mainly because flooding, again, we know very little about flooding in many ways. But with drought, the first thing that will happen is the plant gets hot, it slams shut its stomata, it stops photosynthesizing. That means it slows down its carbon and its sugar production, and it will stop giving it to microbes. So it's not going into the soil anymore, it's conserving everything that it has. Equally, microbial dormancy will ramp up. Microbial dormancy in a normal soil can be anywhere up to 95%. So most of what you have in the soil, they're not doing anything, they're just asleep. Certainly for bacteria, anyway. So then you have this drought situation, you're going to get even more going to sleep. There's nothing you can do. So it's lean times, we're going to go to sleep. But at the same time, the plant might be dropping leaves, adding inputs, that kind of thing, that aren't being decomposed, these kind of dead leaves and bits and pieces that it's just going to slough off. And so then what happens? It'll rain, and the microbes wake up and go, oh my goodness, there is a huge amount of new stuff that has not been metabolized, that's not been eaten, not been munched. And what you see is a gigantic spike of respiration, decomposition, extracellular enzymatic activity. The microbes just go amazing. And we call it the Birch effect. Been known about since the 50s. So it's a measurable kind of sudden ramp up of activity of the microbes. And what that could potentially mean is that we have a big turnover of the microbial community because some of them haven't made it in drought. Some can respond rapidly, some can't. So there's this kind of shift in who can actively do this. Breaking down of all of this brand new substrate, who is close to the plant roots and can suddenly resume operations, and who can't. And potentially that could mean a turnover. And it could also mean a turnover, ultimately, in the plant community itself. So what we could have with the plant soil feedbacks is that, it's created, the plant has harbored this community and this environment that has not withstood the drought and then the flooding very well, or the rainfall, and then suddenly we have this huge problem where the microbes maybe are suddenly accumulating all of these, because a lot of the time what they will do is immobilize the nutrients, and they'll take them into themselves and they won't make them available to the plants. So it's stuck inside that microbial biomass. Alternatively, or at the same time, we might have this, the microbial necromass, where all the dead microbial stuff will just be lysed and it'll all break open, and suddenly you have this enormous wash of nitrogen, phosphorus, unused carbon, various things. So this is going to be very difficult to predict. And we've had a look. I've done some studies, and I have shown that drought quite often will kind of remove any plant soil feedback effect. So I had a couple of species. I had a knapweed, and I had Sanguisorba, salad burnet. One has negative and one has positive plant soil feedback. After drought, it's all neutralized. So there is no net effect after drought. And I suspect it's because of this reorganization of the community, and all of the available nutrients suddenly creates this net zero, which is quite interesting. So there could be consequences. This is horsetail. I'm sure we're all familiar with horsetail. My garden in Manchester's covered in it. But what this could mean is ultimately a shift in the plant community and what is able to remain and establish and continue successfully in that patch of ground, or wherever we're talking about. But invasive species, they have a set of characteristics, we know this, that enable them to invade. It's the 10 by 10 by 10 rule. So 10% can get to an area, 10% can establish, 10% of that will become invasive and a problem. And so they have this set of traits, characteristics, that will enable them to do this. And, they can germinate fast. Their seedlings are quite robust. They can make use of nitrogen and phosphorus and all sorts of things in the soil very, very quickly. They can grow very fast. These are all they put out a lot of seed a lot of the time as well. So this high sort of reproductive effort, just to, we've all seen the Himalayan balsam where you squeeze them and they kind of, it is high reproductive effort in order to establish in this area. So invaders are probably one of the big things that we would be concerned about and things that we need to know more about. And I seem to have put flooding as a bit of an afterthought because, again, there are 2 studies. But essentially, salinity is a big issue with flooding, and that is going to change all of the osmotic capabilities of, and properties of everything that lives in the soil. Not just, salt from the sea, but, different types of salt and different types of potentially heavy metals and so on. So this could have a huge consequence for the different plants that can establish and the different things that can grow. So I'm sorry I am going to be unsatisfactory and not give you any solid answers, but there are things that we know and things that we can conjecture. But there needs to be more research, essentially. So I'm probably going to leave you there. I think questions are going to come at the Q&A session. But yeah, thank you so much to Daryl for inviting me. And thank you very much. Thank you.